Hey guys, I'm going to be giving a talk on advanced usage of ActionText and how you can use it to attach any model in your Rails application to your rich text fields. I'm Chris Oliver. You can find me on Twitter at EXCID3, I run a site called GoRails and record screencasts talking about exactly stuff like this. So we are going to be diving in. If you aren't familiar with ActionText, it's basically a rich text editor for Rails. You've probably used WYSIWYGs or Markdown in the past. This is now built into Rails. It uses the Trix editor, and you can do things like, make your fonts bold, italic, add links, bullets, that sort of thing. But it's also connected to ActiveStorage out of the box, so that you can upload files. So you'll see that in the example here, we upload the Ruby logo to our rich text editor, and everything is connected and uploaded behind the scenes and inserted into our rich text. So all of this is powered by the Trix editor. It's something Basecamp created for this. They use it in Basecamp, obviously. And all of this is being stored as HTML in the backend. So this is a rich text editor that's actually generating HTML, and then when it saves it server side, it's going to save that HTML. So unlike Markdown, where you're saving Markdown and converting it to HTML, you have actual HTML in your database. So like I mentioned, file uploads come out of the box. That's something that's a little bit more tricky in Markdown. You'd actually have to generate some Markdown to insert your files. You can see an example of that if you've ever uploaded a file to GitHub. They use Markdown for their comment system. And one of the big things that makes using HTML a little bit easier than Markdown is things like user mentions, like @mentions. If you were going to use Markdown, you would search for a username, you would replace that with the link to the user, and then render that out in your HTML. GitHub has a library called HTML Pipeline. I believe it was them that created that, and it allows you to put in these filters for your Markdown so you can process that as you generate your HTML. So one of their examples that it comes with, I believe, is a way to search for user mentions and replace them with links to the actual profiles on GitHub and stuff. So you can use that same thing for yourself if you want. However, what happens when the user changes their username? So on this screenshot here, we have an @mention to a user that doesn't exist. And so it's just regular text. You can't click on it. And there's not an easy way to update this to the user's new name. So if you did rename or change your username, you'd have to actually search every single comment ever created and see if it mentions a user, and then go and update that comment with a find and replace in that specific location or multiple locations, and then update that record. You have to do that across your entire database, so that you had every single reference of that up to date, which would be a real pain in the butt. And that's one of the problems that ActionText solves. It is truly rich text. So when you were doing a link to a record in your Rails app, it will actually be a link to the database record, which means that it will always be able to render the current username, the current name, that sort of thing. The other problem with the @mentions here on in Markdown is that it's really hard to do user mentions with spaces in them, because you don't know how many, like if a user's name is typical, you would have two names, two words, a first name and a last name. But there's many names out there that have, junior or senior at the end. So then you have to search 3 words. And there's plenty of others that are more than 3 words too. So how do you know when to stop auto-completing or searching that text to grab that and go find a user? You can really only do these mentions with usernames and not with people's real names. And that's one of the features that you can definitely see. You can start typing a person's real name in Basecamp and it will autocomplete. So we're going to go through examples on how to do that with ActionText. So if you haven't ever set up ActionText before, it's very simple. You run Rails ActionText install. That's going to copy over some migrations, both for ActionText and ActiveStorage, because it uses ActiveStorage to store things like image uploads. And it's going to install the JavaScript for this so that you get, the Trix editor JavaScript. And you'll also want to include the image processing gem to process your images and generate previews and thumbnails and things. So it's pretty straightforward to install. If you want to add a rich text field to any model in your app, you can add has rich text and give it a name. And the has rich text is basically going to generate methods and insert that onto your class. So it's going to add a has one association to an action text rich text with this name of body. And that's how you're going to be able to reference that stuff. It's also going to allow you to eager load the rich text and the embeds, the attachments in them by adding that scope. So that's going to make that easier. So then there's another way to add a rich text field when you're creating a model or a scaffold. This is actually a feature I added to Rails, which is pretty cool. This alongside of the ActiveStorage file uploads are the three fields in the Rails generators that don't actually map to database columns. So your action text stuff is all polymorphic, so you don't have to add any fields to your models to have a rich text field. So this is actually generating kind of a normal field in your scaffolds, but it skips that piece in the migrations. So that will go ahead and create it. You can access the body by saying, dot body on my post. That's going to give you a rich text database record that has your name, and the body is actually an instance of the ActionText content class. And that wraps all of your ActionText HTML, and you'll see that in the string here in the middle. The record type, of course, is the polymorphic association to your model. And we can load the models, like all of our posts, with eager loading their rich text content. And you can also load the attachments as well if you say with rich text content and embeds. It's going to make sure that it loads all of that stuff so you can render that out with without any n+1 queries. So how does ActionText work? Well, we have the ActionText rich text table. This is the association that has one that we talked about. So when we say has rich text body, it's going to have a record related to that in the ActionText rich text. The text column called body is going to store our HTML that gets wrapped as the ActionText content class, which adds some methods around that. And this is an example of the raw data that you would see in there. So this is an example like you saw at the very beginning, just with the image. So you'll see here we have a div, we have a new line, and we have an ActionText attachment. This ActionText attachment tag has some attributes on it, but no content inside of it. And that's kind of the trick here. So the ActionText HTML that's stored in your database, when it references attachments, it's going to minify them and compress them basically so that it doesn't store any of the actual HTML. So if we were to render this out directly in the browser, you would see no image represented at all. And that is because when ActionText goes and parses this HTML to render out for the final version, it's going to look at these attachments, find the database record for ActiveStorage blobs for these images, then render those out as HTML with a certain template, and then insert it in here inside of the ActionText attachment. So the way that it does that is it has a signed global ID or SGID that it has as an attribute here. So it's going to parse that out, and this big long string is a global ID, which allows you to reference a different model in your Rails app. So global ID looks like this. It's gid:// your app, and then your class name and your lookup ID. So what this one would do is grab user number 1. It would just call user.find1. So for signed global IDs, they're basically the exact same thing, but they're signed by the server, and they can have like a purpose as well as expirations. Now, the ActiveStorage or ActionText signed global IDs don't have expirations, but they are marked as for attachable. So this big long string is our signed global ID, and internally, when ActionText is going through every one of those attachments, it finds if it has a signed global ID, it's going to run it through the global ID locator, and that's going to make sure that the signed global ID is correct, and then grab the related record. So in our example with the file upload, it's going to return us an ActiveStorage blob. So that's going to find the image upload for us. That's going to prevent tampering because, of course, if the user is typing the stuff in, you don't want them to be able to actually just change the user ID and point to a different user and print out, someone else's details. And because this will work across any class, it doesn't have to be an active record class as long as it supports global ID lookup. You could use this to reference pretty much anything in your Rails app as long as it supported global ID, which I think only the default stuff is active record models. So that's another thing that you wouldn't want this to be, too editable by a user. So that is probably the most complex part of ActionText. To get these signed global IDs, we actually have to make a request to the server and say, here's our file upload or the user that we want to mention, and the server is going to have to sign that and return the signed global ID to the JavaScript to insert into the page. That way it can't be tampered with and it's generated by the server. So then once it finds that record, it will render a template. There's 2 templates that it might render. By default, they're going to use the same one, but you can change it. So there's a template when you render out this content, but there's also a template when you're editing the content and it's going in the Trix editor. So you can actually have 2 different sets of HTML here for a file upload. One might have an input for the caption. The other one, where it's being rendered for the final version, doesn't need an input. It just needs to render the caption if it exists. So your HTML is going to end up inserting these things, like for the ActiveStorage blobs, you're going to get a figure tag and an image tag and a figure caption and so on. So it's going to include all of that info in your final version of this rendering. So because we need these 2 different types of templates, that is why it definitely doesn't need or should not store this HTML in the database, because it's going to be changing it and replacing it. So why store it if we're going to replace it anyways? So ActiveStorage attachments are used for ActionText RichText. You can see these in your database. This is going to reference the embeds and so on. So that's another thing you should be aware of that is helping to power ActionText to make all of this work. So let's dive into an example. YouTube embeds is a highly, highly requested feature on this, and we're going to walk through how to add that to your application. So first things first is we need to customize the Trix editor so we can start and detect when the user wants to embed a YouTube video in the first place. So the way that we're going to do this is the URL linking. This pops up a little modal when you click the button, and we want it so that when you paste in a YouTube URL, that it will detect that with a regex and then display a little link that says, do you want to embed this? And a button that says, yes, embed this. So what we can do is we can write a little JavaScript that imports Trix so we can customize their toolbar. So we're going to need to import Trix in the language config, because that's used in the Trix editor for internationalization. And then we need to override the get default HTML function. And that needs to return some HTML. I've removed most of it because it's super long. Definitely too long to fit on a slide, but you'll want to go and grab the HTML out of Trix so that you can override it in your JavaScript. So what we need to do is add a little link underneath that inside of that HTML, and we'll make it look like this. Would you like to embed from the site? Yes, embed it. So we'll display this only if we find a matching URL. So Trix's toolbar HTML has a section in here for a dialog, and the link field is the one that we're looking for. So this has a dialog for the href. You'll see that in the grayed out portion up here, but we need to add in our own HTML into that. And so we add our text and our input for the embed URL, and that is our button. And so we'll listen to that when it's clicked, and we'll grab the value out of the link href. And basically we need to go and listen to that URL field. So anytime it changes, we need to run it through our regex matcher, see if it's a YouTube URL, and we can grab the ID out of it. If it is, we'll enable the embed container HTML that we just added, and we'll make that visible. If it's not, we can just hide this so that it disappears. So we need our regex to match all of this. So here's an example regex. You're probably going to need a list of these because YouTube even has many different URLs with the IDs that you can paste in. And so you might need more than just this format. So it's going to be kind of a thing you'll need to loop through and make more complex. But in the basic case, we can use the standard GitHub or YouTube watch URLs with the video ID at the end. So here's what that should look like. We can paste that in, and we will listen to that, and we'll display that text, and then we have this yes embed it button. So now once we have that all working, we'll need to set that up. So I'm going to skip over setting up the event listeners for that button and so on, but it's pretty easy. It's just like listening to any other field for changes. So once we have the user clicking that button, we want to double check and match against that regex, just in case, that button maybe is accidentally displayed and our CSS didn't hide it properly. We can double check with this, and we can also use that to grab the ID of the YouTube video out, and then we can make an AJAX request to our Rails app. So we're going to make a URL called /YouTube. We'll give it the YouTube video ID, and this will be a GET request. If it's successful, then we can insert that attachment into ActionText. And if it's a failure, we can reset the form so we can hide that YouTube embed. So our controller is going to need a YouTube controller that is used specifically for this. Now, this is going to be a controller used specifically for the Trix editor portion of this. So we're going to have it create a YouTube instance. We'll pass in that ID for the YouTube video. And YouTube's special because we don't need to actually make any API requests. We can just have this in memory because we're going to have a string for the URL. We can just put the ID in, and that's our thumbnail URL because it's always the same format. If you needed to, you would, to make an API request, you would go and create a database record and cache that URL or the ID or whatever so that you don't have to do this lookup every single time that you would render things. So this YouTube instance that we're creating here with an ID is going to be what ActionText references in that global ID later on. So if you are doing something that takes a little bit of work, you want to make sure that this is a database record so it can be looked up very quickly rather than creating an instance that needs to make an API request. That would have to run the API request every single time you rendered the ActionText content, which would be very bad. So you don't want to do that in memory, and you want to cache that stuff to the database. So once we have our YouTube instance representing that video, we can render out some HTML content. So we want to render out the YouTube thumbnail. So we got a little partial called YouTube/thumbnail, and we can render that to HTML. And by rendering it to a string, we can include the HTML in our JSON response. Now, YouTube is going to have this method called Attachable SGID, or Attachable Sign Global ID, that we will include in our JSON response. And I'm going to talk about that now. So we'll go into our YouTube class. We need a class to be able to reference all of the ActionText stuff. So first off, we need a way to have an ID kept track of here, our YouTube video ID. So we're going to import active model and active model attributes. That way we can use the attribute ID, and we can make a little find method that will match what the global ID stuff needs. So this is just because we are making something that isn't active record based. We're going to need to import active model and global ID and create our attribute and find to kind of match the API or interface that active record already has. Now, the real important line here is the include ActionText attachable. That is going to make your model attachable to ActionText. It's going to give you that attachable sign global ID that will generate a global ID for this record based on the ID and the class name for you. So it's going to use the global ID functionality to generate that signed global ID and add that attachable SGID method that we just called in the controller. So then we have a couple other methods down here at the bottom. We have thumbnail URL. That way we can easily reference, the YouTube video thumbnail. It's always this same format. But if this changed or was dynamic, we would probably want to cache this to the database. But since it's static, or as far as I know, it's static, we can just insert the ID and voila, we have our image URL or thumbnail URL for our YouTube video. Now, like we talked about earlier, we want especially for videos, in some cases, we want our ActionText attachments to have different renderings in the Trix editor versus our final content. And this is one of those cases. With a YouTube embed, you want your Trix editor to just display a thumbnail. You don't want actually a playable video in your editor. That would be too hard to work with, and it's going to be tricky. You might accidentally play the video when you're trying to select it and just delete it. So it's very hard to work with, and instead, ActionText gives you a method you can override called toTrix content attachment partial path. Long name, but it basically allows you to override the partial path so that it can render out the correct partial for the Trix version of this. This is actually a feature I worked on as well. By default, I think it wasn't even defined, and now it's set up. The default is going to render the normal toPartial path from active record and active model. So that would be like YouTube/YouTube.html ERB is the partial name. So you can override that and provide a different template. If you leave this out, it will render the regular toPartial path template. So our thumbnail template, we just want to display that image tag. We can, do whatever we want in this partial. And because we reference that partial name, this is the file location we're going to need to create that. And we'll do the image tag to the YouTube thumbnail URL. Simple as that. So then for our actual final rendering, it's going to use that toPartial path. We didn't override that. So it's going to render app views YouTube's _YouTube HTML ERB. So when it finds the YouTube class name, that's the default toPartial path. So in that case, we want to render an iframe, which is actually our video. So in this case, our iframe will have a source to youtube.com/embed and our video ID. So there's nothing too complex about that, but that is a nice feature when you need different things in your editor versus otherwise. So let's take a look at an example. If we paste in a YouTube link to one of the videos I've created on GoRails, actually about building the next feature we'll talk about, this will walk you through how all that works. So this is when we click the button, it makes a Rails AJAX request that returns a signed global ID to the JavaScript, and then the content as well, and that embeds it as an attachment on the page inside of Trix, and then we can see these two things being rendered out. So this is an example of how all of that works. And our JavaScript, when the JavaScript response comes back from our AJAX request, we'll just create a new Trix attachment and insert it. So we'll talk about that in our user mentions, which we'll get into a little bit more of the JavaScript portion of this stuff. So for user mentions, where we type the @ symbol and we type a user's name or username, we're going to need an extra JavaScript library to do this. And the one we're going to use is Zurb Tribute. You can use really any of these. I really like Zurb Tribute though, because it is it's capable of matching with spaces. So you'll see that it's typing out people's full names here, and those are being returned here. So this is really nice. And this example is actually using a local collection in memory in JavaScript for the @ symbol, but the hash symbol is actually making an AJAX request to retrieve the HTML or the JSON suggestions, and then you can select from those. And we want, of course, to use an AJAX request to grab the user suggestions in JSON. So to use Tribute, you run yarn add Tributejs. Pretty simple, like every other node module. So we need to build something like a stimulus controller that will go and set up every time that we see a rich text field on the page. And that's something I forgot to mention, but the rich text field, when you render out that editor, your scaffold will generate this for you. But normally you have a text field or text area. There's a rich text field that you can use for creating your Tribute or your Trix and your ActionText form field. So for Tribute, we need to import the CSS and the JavaScript. And if we use a stimulus controller that we can add to our rich text field, then it will be set up to use Tribute on every single one of those. We can remove it as well. So if we don't want @mentions in a certain rich text field, we just remove the stimulus controller attributes from the field and we're done. So the other benefit of this is that it's going to create a different stimulus controller instance for each one of those fields. So if you were doing like a survey and you had multiple rich text attributes, you could have multiple rich text fields, and each one of those could be set up with an instance of our mentions stimulus controller. So when our stimulus controller connects, we're going to be able to grab the field. We could probably also skip the target here and just reference this .element, I think. But the Trix editor will be set up as editor on our field. So we'll save a reference to this .editor so that we can access Trix anytime we need to, and we'll initialize Tribute. And then when we disconnect, we just want to remove Tribute and detach it from that field before TurboLinks caches the HTML on the page. So initializing Tribute is straightforward. We can create a new Tribute instance. We can say allow spaces. That's going to allow us to have names with spaces in between, the first name, last name, and so on. Lookup is for taking the JSON response of all the user suggestions, and we look at the name attribute or property in those, and we filter out by that. Then for values, we can have a method called fetch users. It will take the text that you've already typed and a callback, and we just make an AJAX request to the server to get mentions that match that text that you've already typed. And if there are some, we'll call the callback. Otherwise, if there is no response or an error or something, we'll just have an empty array that we pass to the callback. And then, of course, we attach tribute to our rich text field, so it can listen to that. And all of that will be connected so that when we're typing in the field, Tribute will be analyzing that, looking for you to type the @ symbol. And if you do, then it's going to listen to the next characters and keep track of what characters you've typed so far and all of that. So then server side, we make our AJAX request and we pass it the text you've typed, like CHR, and then the server needs to find all usernames that start with CHR and so on. So we have some sort of query to do this. Using SQLite for an example here, we can use like, and then we have our query for the text, and we put a % sign at the end that will find anything that starts with CHR and doesn't care what it ends with. This is also case insensitive in SQLite, so that will take care of what we need. But if you're using Postgres, or you can use PG search or Elasticsearch or anything for this, as long as you can query your names. Probably want them all to be downcased and so on. It is a thing that you can spend a bit more time on, trying to get good matching of names set up in the server side. So we have a very trivial example to do that, but it'll work for our use case. So then we need to go through all of those users that we found that match that name, and then we need to generate a JSON response. So this is going to be very similar to our YouTube embeds. We need our SGID, which is our attachable SGID, and our content, the HTML that we want to insert into the Trix editor. But we've also included that name in there. That name's going to be, like I mentioned before, what Tribute will filter this JSON array with. So it's going to look at that property and filter it out accordingly. So our users need ActionText attachable, and of course, because they are active record objects, we don't need to include active model or global ID or any of those things. This is going to be all you need to do as long as you have an active record model. So very, very simple. And in users cases, when we're doing @mentions, we want the exact same display of those users in the editor as with the final version. So we don't need to worry too much about overriding the toTrix content attachment partial path, because it's going to be the same thing basically for this. And what's really neat about this, and if you've seen or used Basecamp, your partial for this user can actually include their avatar. So it's really neat to be able to @mention a user, see their avatar and their name. If they go and update their avatar, then your next time you refresh the page, when their user mention is rendered in your text, it will display the current avatar. It's not caching any of that, and so it's going to always render the latest version of it, which is neat. Or you can cache it, but it's not caching it in the ActionText HTML itself, like you would see with Markdown or any other WYSIWYG editor. So here's an example of our JSON response. We have an array of JavaScript objects, JSON objects that have a name, an SGID, and our content. And so our example is just super simple. We have a span tag and the user's name. We can insert their avatar in there. Doesn't really matter, but you can put anything you want in here. So then Tribute is a little tricky because you've been typing into your Trix editor the @mention, like @CHR, or in this case @HENR to get the Henrys filter down. So when you're typing that text, it's actually living still in the Trix editor, and you don't want to save that. And so when you select a user, we want to delete that. So we can use the paste HTML callback inside of Tribute, and it will give us the HTML and the start position and the end position. So we can actually interact with Trix to go and select the text you've already written. So if we grab the current position in Trix and we move backwards, the amount of characters you typed, so like the @ symbol and the HENR for Henry, we could go and basically highlight all the way back to the @ symbol and then delete it. And that's what this paste HTML function is doing. It's going to the calculating the length of stuff you've typed, taking the current position, moving back to the @ symbol, and then just deleting all of that with a backspace, basically. So get selected range and set selected range is going to highlight text like you would do with your mouse cursor. And then we delete in direction backwards with a backspace. If you delete in direction forward, it's like hitting the delete key instead. So here's basically what that looks like. If we type @HENR and we hit to insert one of these Henrys, we are going to set the selected range to highlight @HENR, our autocomplete suggestion thing there that we've typed, and we just want to delete that. So then the next step is to actually insert the Henry we selected and the HTML we got from the server. So there's an event listener called Tribute Replace. We listen to this and then we insert our Trix attachment. So we can grab the JSON for Henry by saying event.detail.item.original. That's going to grab our JSON object for it that Tribute has filtered out for us. And then we need to insert our Trix attachment. This is the same code we would do on the YouTube example. Just insert the SGID and the content, and voila, you have a Trix attachment that is safe for ActiveStorage to save. And then we insert our attachment, and then we can just add a space at the end so that you can continue typing and you don't have to hit space after typing the name. Simple as that. So what that will do is insert Henry Gukowski into our editor. And what's kind of interesting about this is it is a HTML tag, a span tag. And while you might normally be able to, edit and delete this text, that is treated as a single object. It's a single character in Trix. So if you hit delete or the backspace key or click this X, it's going to delete all of Henry Gukowski, and you aren't able to edit his name at all. It's going to just render out whatever HTML was sent from the server side. So that is a nice thing that you can get rid of a user reference just by doing that, just by hitting the X, and it is a single object inside of Trix. So here's how user mentions look. We can type a user's name. We see our autocompletes. If we make a mistake and there's no results, it says no matches found. We hit enter, inserts their full name, deletes the text we typed, and if we render it and go back to the editor, we can, change the name, we can delete a name. All of those references are kept intact before and after we render this. So that is kind of the end-to-end example with user mentions. You could add in your avatars like I mentioned. You just make them small, whatever text size it is, and probably make them rounded or something to look pretty. And you could have a much richer text experience similar to what you would see on Basecamp. That was always the example. I was like, oh man, they did a really good job. I would love to do that in Rails, and here we are. We can now do that in Rails. So those two examples are pretty cool, but look at this. If we go into our terminal and we update the user's name and just refresh the page, we can change Flavio's name to my name, Chris Oliver, and refresh our page. And next time it renders, it's going to say, hey, Chris Oliver, and just update and use the latest version. So that is kind of the real magic to the ActionText stuff, because it is referencing actual instances of, database records or other classes in your code. You have always the latest version of that. Nothing will be stale, but of course this is a little bit more complex because any attachment you add now needs to be signed by the server. So you can't just add a regular Trix attachment like you might be used to if you've used Trix in the past. Those all must have SGIDs, otherwise it will just remove that attachment when it does the final rendering. There are some exceptions like the horizontal rules that I know are kind of built into ActionText right now. I need to go and look into that a little bit more myself and see how they set up that one, but it is not the easiest to go add a new feature, but because it is pretty robust, you can actually do all kinds of complex things. So my friend Jason was talking about how would we go and add tables to ActionText, and that is a good question. There's a lot of things that, are you referencing maybe a database model for your table? Probably not. You probably want your individual cells to be something. So there's a lot of things you'll have to dive into in depth in Trix and ActionText to kind of get an idea of how you would actually implement something more complex, like adding tables and columns and rows into your ActionText output. And you just have a little bit more complexity with ActionText, but because you can use the signed global IDs, it gives you a whole lot of nice functionality that until they use the signed global IDs, I didn't actually know how I would reliably and securely reference user models and other things in my rich text, and this is a great way to do that. So that is it for the introduction to how to do some more advanced things with ActionText. If you want to see the source code for all of this, I've got it on GitHub. You can find it in the link there. You can find more videos and stuff that I've made on GoRails.com and post videos weekly about ActionText and things like this. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I wish we could be in person to hang out together at RailsConf, but I will talk to you guys in the chat and the comments instead.